Welcome everyone tonight to our first Jumping Worms webinar titled Worms on the Move, Digging into the Invasion and Impacts of Jumping Worms in New Brunswick. So this webinar is being hosted in partnership with Dr. Erin from St. Mary's University, and we would like to thank the New Brunswick Wildlife Trust Fund for funding work related to this project. Just a little before we get into the presentation, a little bit about the New Brunswick Invasive Species Council. So we're a nonprofit organization based in Fredericton, New Brunswick. We are guided by a steering committee made up of various representatives from different NGOs, government, industry, academia, and recreational stakeholders. And we are a chapter of the National Canadian Council on Invasive Species. So the main pillars of our work is outreach and education, on the ground projects, and doing strategic management with various partners. So a little bit of housekeeping before we jump into the presentation. So the presentation currently and will be recorded and will be available on our website and on our social media pages within the next few days. So currently, all participants' microphones are muted. But we will turn the microphones on during the question period at the end. And if you do have any questions, during the presentation, feel free to put them in the chat. And as afterwards, we will address the questions that are in the chat. For more information, feel free to visit the New Brunswick Invasive Species Council website. If you have any questions, feel free to send us an email. And with that, I will hand the presentation over to Dr. Erin.
Great, thanks, Claire. I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. Let me know, Claire, if it's not showing up well, but it should be okay.
Yep, it looks good.
Super. Okay. Yeah, thanks for organizing this to Claire and the New Brunswick Invasive Species Council, and thanks for coming. So I'm going to talk about earthworms in Canada more broadly to start with, then I'll move into jumping worms and what we know about them in New Brunswick at this point. So if you have worms in your garden in New Brunswick or elsewhere in Canada, they're almost certainly introduced European earthworms. This is because in most of Canada and the United States, they were extirpated during the last glaciation. So the red line on this picture is the southern extent of the Pleistocene glacial limit. So pretty well, most of Canada was glaciated. We do have some native species in areas that were unglaciated, and on this figure, the shaded areas are where native earthworms have been found. Since this figure was made, there's also been one likely native species that's been found in New Brunswick. That's a species that's been spreading around a bit more. Most of the native earthworms haven't expanded. Of course, you do have earthworms either in your yard or you see them around the city, undoubtedly. And these earthworms arrived in Canada with the first European settlers, so they would have come on ship's ballast or in ship's ballast or associated with plants or soil. We have about 40 species of earthworms in Canada, and about 9 of those are native, and the rest are introduced. Earthworms can be divided into these 3 main functional groups: epigeic species, which are also, they're litter-dwelling species that live near the soil surface or live in the leaf litter layer, basically, and they're relatively small. Then there's endogeic species that live more in the mineral soil. Those would be species that you commonly would see in your garden. And then there's anisic species, which are the largest species. They live in deep burrows but feed on the soil surface. So you'll also see them around the city quite a bit. And if you have bumps in your lawn, it's probably from these earthworms. Jumping worms, which I'll get into more in a minute, are epiendozoic species, so they live both in the litter layer and the mineral soil layer. So here I'm still talking about earthworms overall. And before I really talk about jumping worms, I want to make it somewhat clear that earthworms in general aren't native. So yeah, most of the earthworms in Canada aren't native to Canada, and they do have some effects on soil and plants and ecosystems. So these pictures are from a hardwood forest in the US, but basically they show the common effects of earthworms on soil. On the left side, you can see a forest floor with no earthworms present. So there's a thick leaf litter layer and kind of a well-defined mineral soil layer below it. Then on the other side of the slide, you can see once earthworms have invaded, there's a much thinner leaf litter layer at the top and more mixing of the soil horizons. And these effects on soil can cascade up to affect plants as well. So also from a northern hardwood forest, you can see when no earthworms are present, there's a pretty diverse understory layer of plants. But once earthworms have invaded, there can be much less diversity, and the systems can be, or ecosystems can be dominated by kind of carex or sedge species. So there has been some research showing significant declines in plant species diversity as earthworm diversity increases for European earthworms in North America. So earthworms are ecosystem engineers, and that means they affect the structure and function of ecosystems. So their effects on soil structure can lead to effects on nutrient cycling, microbial processes, and soil food webs, and those effects can cascade up to affect plant communities and even vertebrates like songbirds. These effects have been much more well studied for European earthworms, but there's also some research on jumping worms and their impacts, which I'll talk about next. So basically, the arrival of European earthworms and their spread in Canada is kind of considered to be the first wave of earthworm invasions, and then the second wave is these jumping worms. Jumping worms did arrive in North America in 1867, but they didn't seem, that was in California, they didn't seem to spread since then for quite a while. So it's only in the last 20 to 30 years that they've been spreading more rapidly. Now they occur in 38 American states, most of which you can see highlighted in yellow in this figure. And they were first found in Ontario in 2014 in Windsor, and then in New Brunswick in 2021 and Nova Scotia in 2022. There's also potential reports from Quebec, so they do seem to be spreading. So jumping worms belong to a different family than the European earthworms. It's called Megascolicidae, and it actually includes more than 1,000 described species worldwide. 16 of those species are now found in North America, and there's about 3 that seem to be the ones spreading. They're originally native to East and Southeast Asia. So it seems likely that they're spreading into Canada from the US rather than farther away. Just to give you an idea of original or distributions in native areas, you can see the distribution in Japan for the 3 most common species of jumping worms in North America, and then below the distributions in North America as of 2020. So it doesn't have the New Brunswick and Nova Scotia locations. So Memphis agrestis is the most common species on the left, then Metaphyre hilgendorfi, also quite common, and Memphis tokyoensis, a little less common. Now you might be wondering a bit about what these species look like. So here the top row, or actually the top 2 rows are all jumping worms, and the bottom row are European earthworms. So they do look relatively similar, but I'll show, I think, on the next slide how you can identify them a bit better. So if you look at this video here that I'll play, this is the jumping motion that jumping worms make. I'll play it once more. So they're not actually vertically jumping, but they do this thrashing behavior when disturbed. And the other thing that distinguishes them easily from European earthworms is this. I should have got my pointer. Let's see. Okay, this band here, it's called the clotellum, and adults have it. It's a reproductive structure. So for jumping worms, this goes right around the body. For European earthworms, it doesn't go right around the body. So if you flip them over, it looks a bit different underneath. They're called jumping worms, obviously, because of that motion, but in other places, they're called a variety of names, such as disco worms or snake worms or crazy worms or wrigglers, Alabama jumpers. Not all of the jumping worms actually jump. So some of them won't, but all of the ones that have been found in Canada so far are species that jump. Oops. Stuck on this. There we go. So if you have the ability to look at under a microscope, that's the other way we tell them apart, or more precisely can tell them apart. Here on the left, you can kind of hopefully see that there are a lot of little hairs on each segment of the worm. Just right across, there's these little bumps, maybe especially visible in this lower area. This is a jumping worm, and for European earthworms, these hairs, they only have, or they're called setae, they're really bristles. They only have 8 per segment, and they're in pairs. So one pair here, another pair here, another there, rather than being right around the earthworm. So this is the easiest way to tell them apart under a microscope. Okay. Oops. Just a little, gotta get rid of my laser pointer. So jumping worms produce eggs, which are called cocoons, but they're really eggs. And this is generally why they're a really successful invader, because they're parthenogenetic, meaning they can produce, if they produce just one individual can produce a cocoon, it doesn't need a mate. So even one of these cocoons can start a population. The bottom row are fully hydrated cocoons, and the top row are slightly dehydrated. They basically look like particles of soil, so it's quite difficult to distinguish them from the soil. They do look slightly different between species. So Invasive agrestis, the species that we've found in New Brunswick, well, there's more than one species that's been found, but the more common species is on the left there. I just added this slide to this presentation because we went out to New Brunswick, I'm in Halifax now. We went out to New Brunswick last week and found very few jumping worms in the main place where we found them before. And that's because of their life cycle. So they don't survive winter, they overwinter as cocoons. Then the cocoons hatch in the spring and develop into adults. So right now we only saw a few juveniles, probably given how cold parts of the spring have been. that's not too surprising. So why do jumping worms matter? They can fundamentally change the structure of the soil. So it looks a lot like coffee grounds after a jumping worm invasion if you have a high enough density, as you can see here. So that the soil is really granular and dry. And those effects in the soil can cause changes in plant communities. It depends on the species whether they're negatively impacted or not impacted. There's also some research showing declines in invertebrate and vertebrate populations, particularly salamanders are affected. But most research all of the research on impacts has been done in the USA, and there hasn't been a lot of research yet. But a recent review kind of tried to summarize the different effects that jumping worms or ferritomoids can have. So here you can see they can have effects above ground in green and effects below ground in brown. And these effects may be chemical effects. So for example, metals can bioaccumulate in heavy metals can bioaccumulate in the earthworms, and that can lead to bioaccumulation in the food web. There can be physical effects. That's the main effect, really, due to disappearance of leaf litter. And then this can lead to biological effects on plant communities, vertebrate predators, and effects on other detritivores and microbes below ground. Now that I've given you some idea of what jumping worms are and what their impacts are, I want to talk about jumping worms in New Brunswick and what we know so far, which isn't too much because we only started working on it last year. But so one of the things that we did last year was try to survey a bunch of different locations to figure out where jumping worms are found. We got to about 20 locations around the Fredericton and St. John areas. The reason we were sampling in this part of the province is because the first invasion was from this region as well. So we found them at 4 different locations shown in purple here. A couple of them are kind of overlapping. And the locations where we didn't find jumping worms are shown in gray. Obviously, the sample size isn't large enough at this point to draw too many conclusions, but I do want to note that they were basically always associated with mulch or compost, or the landowner having brought in mulch, compost, or plants from nurseries. So that suggests that those could be important vectors in spread. And that's consistent with what people have said in the US as far as vectors of spread for jumping worms. In addition to doing these broader surveys, which we hope to expand this year more towards Moncton, we did a more detailed study at one site near Oromocto. So this is where jumping worms were first observed in 2021. Undoubtedly, they were at the other sites that we found them at this point, but this was the first place they were noticed. There are 3 jumping worm species that have been observed at that site: Metaphyre hilgendorfi, Amynthus tokyoensis, and Amynthus minimus. There's still some identification work to be done, however. At this site, we tried to address 3 research questions. So we wanted to look at whether jumping worms were affecting the abundance of European earthworms and their biomass. We wanted to look at whether jumping worms impact soil properties and carbon, such as carbon and nitrogen. And we wanted to compare 2 different sampling methods to see what was most effective. This was an honors thesis project for one of my students, Samantha Bennett. I think I have a picture of her at the end. So I'll walk through basically the setup of this study. This is the only research on impacts in New Brunswick, or for that matter, Canada, that's been published. Yeah, there's probably other research going on, but it hasn't been published yet. So at this site, there's a central area in the middle where the jumping worms were first observed. So we made this grid around it, so a transect in each direction. The green shapes here are houses, and the brown rectangle is an area that had soil and stuff brought in, so we weren't sure if that would affect occurrence of jumping worms. The white is a road. So we placed wooden discs along each of these transects that were 10 meters apart, and we laid out 28 in total. That was done in the spring of 2022. And then in August, we went back to sample. So we sampled 28 plots near each wooden disc. We used a mustard solution to sample the earthworms. This is kind of a standard, or it's a very standard technique used for earthworm sampling. It's the same mustard that you'd buy, mustard powder that you'd buy at a grocery store mixed with water. It irritates the skin of the earthworms, so they come up to the surface and then you can pick them up. So we applied this mustard solution in these squares that you can kind of see here. And we also flipped over our wooden discs, which you can see here, and counted the earthworms under them. So we identified the earthworms and divided them into European earthworms, which are in the family Lumbricidae, and jumping worms in the family Megascolicidae. And so what we found was that European earthworms were detected at 26 quadrats, so almost every location, whereas jumping worms were detected at only 18 of the locations sampled, shown in black here. So the red dots are the quadrats where we didn't find jumping worms. Then we did a regression analysis to try to look at whether there were any effects, but there were no effects of jumping worm abundance or jumping worm biomass on European earthworm abundance or biomass. So the answer to our first question was no, not at this stage. Of course, it is near the beginning of this invasion as far as we know. So our plan for this year is to try to go back and resample and look at whether jumping worms have spread farther along these lines. That will give us an idea of spread rates of jumping worms. There's no data on that, which kind of hampers the ability to model future distributions of these species. Our next objective was looking at jumping worm effects on soil properties. Specifically, we looked at effects on soil carbon and nitrogen. Nitrogen is important for plants, and carbon more so. Well, we were interested in it more because of the greenhouse gas implications. So we collected soil samples from 28 quadrats, all of the quadrats, to examine effects on carbon and nitrogen. And what we found was that the carbon concentration was very similar in the quadrats with jumping worms and the quadrats that didn't have jumping worms, for 2.4% and 2.9%. Similarly, nitrogen concentration was also quite similar between locations with jumping worms and without jumping worms, 0.19% and 0.21%. So not surprisingly, those differences were not significant. Jumping worm biomass had no significant effects on soil nitrogen levels. We did find a significant effect of jumping worm abundance on soil nitrogen. And there were no effects on carbon as well, I should add. So I'll show on the next slide what our graph looks like for effects of jumping worm abundance on nitrogen. Basically, you can see that on the left side of the graph, there isn't much of a pattern between jumping worm abundance and percent nitrogen. Or there's kind of a linear relationship, I should say, on the left-hand side. Let me get the pointer out because that will help. So here you can see as jumping worm abundance increases, the percent nitrogen increases. But then there's this one plot which had the highest jumping worm abundance and lower nitrogen. So we think that there might be some sort of threshold where very high abundance of jumping worms lowers the percent nitrogen again. But the sample size is really too small to say anything too conclusive about this. So we hope to keep looking at this in the future. The final objective that we wanted to look at in this study was comparing these two different sampling methods. So this mustard technique that I mentioned has been used pretty widely, but the wooden disc method hasn't been used before. We wanted to try that as a way that might be easier for multiple samples to be taken each year. Basically, you can flip the disc and just check if there's jumping worms underneath rather than taking them out. So it might be useful to look at activity over the course of a season. And we also thought that the discs could be easier for citizen scientists if we were just to pass out wooden discs versus giving instructions about mustard. So we wanted to see if they were equally effective at detecting the presence of jumping worms. We looked at this at the 28 locations that we sampled, and these were the results. Using the mustard solution, we found jumping worms at 14 of the locations, and using the wooden discs, we found jumping worms at 13 of the locations. So the detection rates were 78% for mustard and 72% for wooden discs. So there is no significant difference between the two. Just to explain the figure here, that's a little complicated. So if it's a white box, there are no jumping worms detected at all. If you see a red half of a box, that means jumping worms were detected by the wooden disc. And the yellow half a box means that jumping worms were detected using mustard solution. So if the box is both red and yellow, both methods detected jumping worms. So you can see that there is some variation in detection. Sometimes they're detected with the mustard solution, and sometimes they're detected with the wooden disc only. We will probably look into this a bit more in the future and try some different sizes of discs and different lengths of time that the wooden discs are left out for. In addition to looking at that, I think this small study highlights that substantial research is still needed. So as I mentioned, we don't have data on jumping worm population spread rates. That's not available in the US or Canada, so we can't just take information from another area and use that to model spread in New Brunswick. We really need to get that data. And then we don't have a good idea on how time since invasion can affect the impacts of jumping worms. So we know that this is likely a relatively recent invasion. but will the impacts change over time? So hopefully we'll be able to keep working there to look at that. So that brings me to the part of the talk about what you can do. So you should, ideally, if you think that jumping worms are worth trying to avoid, given that they can have pretty substantial effects in gardens as well as potentially forests, you should check for jumping worms when you're buying plants, compost, or soil. Ideally, clean compost and soil from vehicles, equipment, and tools before you move between sites. When possible, it's best to buy bare root plants or propagate from cuttings and seed. Of course, that can be a somewhat difficult one. And it would be great if you can report sightings to the New Brunswick Invasive Species Council so that we can get a better idea of how or what the distribution of these species are in New Brunswick. Another piece of advice is to try to purchase soil mulch or compost that has been heated following protocols for reducing pathogens. So that would be a minimum of 40 degrees Celsius, or to solarize the material yourself. You can also wash the roots of plants yourself, although that's a bit more work. So these are a couple of fact sheets that we put together with the New Brunswick Invasive Species Council. If you want more information, I think they have also a species card available on their website. So thank you for listening. I'm happy to answer some jumping worm questions. As Claire said, funding for this work was provided by the New Brunswick Wildlife Trust Fund, and a lot of the work was done by Samantha Bennett, who you can see here in the middle, an honors student, and Helen Phillips, postdoc working at St. Mary's. Thanks. I'll maybe just stop sharing my screen, I guess.
Perfect. Thanks, Erin. So I did turn on the ability for our guests to use their mics. So if you do have any questions, feel free to either unmute yourself and ask the question, or you can also put it in the chat function as well.
Yeah, I can see the chat too, so either.
I had a question. This is Jen. Hi. Erin, when you mentioned early in the talk that they were introduced in California in, I think it was 1867, and then it seemed to be a long time. So what did you mention? Why they're spreading more rapidly now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure it's really known. I think the species that first arrived might not have been. So what was that species called? Metaphyre californica. I think it's a species that isn't as aggressive of an invader. So it might have been partly like the arrival of these species that are better at invading new areas. Otherwise, I guess, yeah, I think it's more trade of plants and compost and mulch would be likely reasons. But yeah, I haven't seen much explanation of that. So that's a really great question.
Okay.
Why it would have taken off now. I think I can also mention, like, there was some work done in the 1970s where someone looked at shipments coming into the US and found a number of species of jumping worms in shipments at that time. So they've definitely been coming in more recently, probably. But yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Nice. Anyone else have any questions?
I guess I'll add a tiny bit more information then. And there's an ambulance passing. Yeah, the species that are common now, they think that they might have arrived with cherry trees that were donated to the Washington, D.C. area in like 1912 or so. So, yeah.
Oh, that's unfortunate.
Yeah.
Well-meaning.
Yeah, nice present, but
with some unexpected gifts with that.
Yeah.
Well, I think if there isn't any other questions right now, I guess we can wrap this webinar up. But if anyone does have any questions after this, feel free to reach out to either Dr. Erin Cameron herself, or feel free to reach out to NBISC, and we can forward along any questions to Erin. She just put her email in the chat. And in that case, thanks so much, Erin, for hosting the webinar tonight. Thank you again to our funder, the Wildlife Trust Fund, for helping to make events like this possible. And the recording will be available in the next few days, hopefully. So thanks, everyone.
Great. Thank you.